The story always begins the same way, with a version you think you already know. Here's the shocking question no one ever dared to ask out loud. What if the most important man in Meghan Markle's life was never the one standing beside her in public? Not a prince, not a husband, not even a lover, at least not in the way the tabloids understand it. But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. What if the person who truly understood Meghan Markle was the man who never spoke until now? For years, Markus Anderson existed on the edges of photographs, half in the frame, half erased, always present, yet never explained. He wasn't the headline. He wasn't the scandal. He wasn't the one waving to cameras or delivering carefully scripted lines. He was something far more dangerous to a controlled narrative. He was quiet, and silence, when broken, is louder than any scream. According to those who claim to know what Markus has finally revealed, the Meghan the public consumed was not the Meghan he knew. Not even close. While the world saw confidence, confrontation, and control, Markus allegedly saw something else entirely. Someone private, guarded, intimate only on her own terms. A woman who chose silence strategically, not because she lacked a voice, but because she understood the power of withholding it. Let that sink in. The same woman portrayed as perpetually misunderstood, perpetually silenced, may have been the one doing the silencing behind closed doors. And here's where the story gets uncomfortable. Markus did not describe Meghan as reckless, or impulsive, or emotionally exposed. He described her as precise, selective, almost surgical with intimacy. According to what's now being whispered, closeness was not freely given. It was earned, and sometimes it was revoked without warning. Ask yourself this. How many relationships in Meghan's life seemed to end abruptly? How many friendships dissolved without explanation? How many people vanished from her orbit just as quickly as they appeared? Coincidence or pattern? Markus, unlike everyone else, never rushed to explain her, never defended her publicly, never contradicted her either. He stayed where he always was, close enough to know, quiet enough to be trusted. And that trust, if these revelations are true, came at a cost. Because when someone controls their private world as tightly as Meghan allegedly did, the people inside it are never sure where they stand. Are they chosen? Or are they temporary? Are they confidants? Or are they placeholders? This story matters now because timing is never accidental. People don't speak after years of silence unless something has shifted. Pressure builds, loyalty erodes, or a truth becomes too heavy to carry alone. And Markus, the man who never needed attention, may have finally decided that silence protects no one, especially not him. Because the moment he described Meghan as a private, intimate girl, everything changed. The phrase alone unsettled people who thought they understood her. It contradicted the image. It reframed the past. And it raised a chilling question no one was prepared to answer. If Meghan controlled intimacy so carefully, then who was really in control all along? And just when you think that question is unsettling, what Markus reveals next forces an even darker one. Because being close to someone like that doesn't just change you, it traps you. What if the most powerful person in the room is the one who never speaks? That's the uncomfortable thought that hangs in the air the moment you start looking closely at Markus Anderson. Because once you notice him, you can't unsee him. He's there at the right dinners, the right parties, the right turning points. Not front and center, not posing, not posturing. Just there. Always there. Here's the part that should make you pause. Markus didn't rise with Meghan. He was already positioned. While others came and went, he stayed. While friendships flared and fizzled, his presence remained steady, almost immune to the chaos that followed her everywhere else. That alone is strange. Think about it. Public figures shed people constantly. Assistants rotate. Friends drift. Allies fall out. Yet Markus never seemed to be pushed out, replaced, or publicly discarded. He didn't speak on her behalf. He didn't sell stories. He didn't rush to defend her when headlines exploded. He didn't even contradict the narrative when it spiraled. Why? According to what's now being whispered, it's because Markus understood something others didn't. Meghan didn't reward noise. She rewarded discretion. And Markus was the quietest person in the room. Sources claim their bond wasn't loud or performative. It wasn't built on public affection or dramatic declarations. It was built on access, on proximity, on being allowed behind the curtain without asking questions that threatened control. Ask yourself this. How many people in Meghan's life were allowed to see her without an audience? Very few. And Markus was one of them. He allegedly didn't just know what Meghan said in public. He knew what she withheld. He saw the moments when the cameras were gone and the performance stopped. And what he saw, according to those close to the situation, didn't match the image sold to the world. Instead of impulsive emotion, there was calculation. Instead of emotional oversharing, there was restraint. Instead of vulnerability, there were boundaries so firm they felt immovable. This is where the phrase private intimate girl starts to take shape. Not intimate in the way tabloids crave. Not reckless. Not exposed. Intimate in the sense that closeness was rare, conditional, and tightly controlled. You didn't drift into Meghan's inner circle. You were invited. And invitations could be revoked without explanation. People noticed. Relationships stalled. Friends disappeared. And those who asked questions didn't last long. Markus, however, never pushed. Never demanded. Never overstepped. He stayed exactly where he was allowed to be. Which raises another unsettling question. Was his silence loyalty? Or survival? Because when intimacy becomes a privilege instead of a bond, everyone inside that space is walking on invisible lines. One wrong step, one wrong question, and access vanishes. And Markus saw that happen. Over and over again. But here's the twist that changes everything. He wasn't just watching others get cut off. He was learning how power really worked in Meghan's world. And what he learned would eventually force him to make a choice he never expected to face. Because staying silent is easy until the truth starts implicating you. And that's where this story takes a sharp turn. What if the version of Meghan Markle the world fell in love with was the least accurate one of all? That's the question that starts to nag once Markus's alleged perspective comes into focus. Because according to what he revealed, the Meghan he knew didn't thrive on exposure. She didn't crave emotional chaos. And she certainly didn't operate from impulse. In fact, the very traits that critics and supporters argue about may have been the most carefully constructed parts of her public identity. Here's the contradiction that stops people cold. Publicly, Meghan was framed as emotionally open, raw, willing to share pain, trauma, and personal struggle on a global stage. But privately, Markus claims emotional access was rare, controlled, almost rationed. You didn't stumble into her inner world through empathy alone. You earned proximity through compliance, trust, and an unspoken understanding of boundaries you were never allowed to question. Let that sit with you for a moment. How does someone appear so emotionally exposed to millions, while remaining deeply closed off to the people physically closest to them? According to those familiar with Markus's account, Meghan understood something most people don't. Vulnerability can be performed without ever being surrendered. Tears can be shown without access being granted. Stories can be shared without revealing the core. And Markus watched this play out repeatedly. People entered her orbit believing they were getting closer, only to realize later that they were still standing at the gate. Conversations stayed curated. Confidences stayed selective. Even moments that felt intimate, Markus suggested, were often structured, not spontaneous. This wasn't coldness. It was control. And for some, that control was intoxicating. Being chosen felt special. Being allowed in, even partially, felt like validation. But for others, it was destabilizing. They sensed something was off. That emotional reciprocity never quite arrived. That closeness always seemed conditional. Ask yourself this. Have you ever felt close to someone who never fully let you in? Now imagine that dynamic multiplied by fame, power, and influence. Markus allegedly saw the cost of that imbalance. He saw people question themselves, doubt their worth, wonder what they'd done wrong when access suddenly cooled or disappeared entirely. And through it all, Meghan remained composed, unrattled, unexplained. This is where the phrase private intimate girl becomes less romantic and more revealing. Intimacy, in this context, wasn't warmth. It was currency. And like any currency, it was tightly regulated. But here's the part no one expected. Markus didn't just observe this pattern. At some point, he realized he was part of it. Because being trusted by someone who controls intimacy so precisely doesn't make you powerful. It makes you complicit. And once Markus understood that, the silence he'd maintained for years became much harder to justify. Because what happens when the person guarding the truth realizes the truth might be guarding something darker. And that's exactly where this story turns next. What happens when silence stops being neutral and starts becoming dangerous? That's the question Markus Anderson allegedly had to confront once he understood his position wasn't accidental. Because at some point, being the quiet one in the room stops looking like loyalty and starts looking like endorsement. Here's the unsettling truth Markus is said to have realized. When intimacy is controlled, everyone around it becomes manageable. People don't just want closeness. They want reassurance. They want consistency. And when those things are rationed, people bend themselves into whatever shape keeps them inside the circle. Short sentences now. Because this part matters. People complied. People stayed quiet. People ignored red flags. Not because they were weak, but because they didn't want to lose access. According to what Markus allegedly revealed, this was the real cost of being close to Meghan. Emotional ambiguity. Relationships that felt meaningful but never secure. Affection that appeared, disappeared, then returned without explanation. And the worst part? The silence around it made people blame themselves. Was it something I said? Something I did? Something I failed to understand? Markus saw this pattern repeat, over and over. And while others spiraled trying to regain footing, Meghan stayed steady, centered, unaffected, not cruel, not chaotic, just immovable. That's when the word control starts to shift from neutral to chilling. Because control doesn't always look like aggression. Sometimes it looks like calm. Sometimes it looks like composure. Sometimes it looks like never raising your voice while everyone else is quietly unraveling. Ask yourself this: which is more powerful? Someone who explodes or someone who never has to? Markus allegedly began to see how his silence protected more than privacy. It protected a structure, one where questions weren't forbidden, but asking them came with consequences. Where loyalty wasn't demanded, but deviation was remembered. And suddenly, his role felt heavier. He wasn't just a witness. He was a stabilizer. Someone whose presence reassured others that everything was normal, that nothing was wrong, that if Markus was still there, then things must be fine. But what if they weren't? That realization, sources claim, created a fracture. Because once you understand your silence is part of the system, staying quiet becomes a choice. And choices come with responsibility. Here's the contradiction that shook him most. The world believed Meghan was constantly under attack, constantly misunderstood, constantly at the mercy of others. Yet privately, she may have been the one setting the emotional terms, deciding who stayed, who left, who mattered, and who became invisible. That doesn't make her a villain, but it does make her powerful. And power, when unexamined, always leaves damage behind. So Markus faced a crossroads no one saw coming. Continue being the quiet constant, the familiar face in the background, or speak and risk unraveling not just her narrative, but his own role in sustaining it. Because once you tell the truth about someone who controls intimacy, you don't just expose them. You expose yourself. And the moment Markus chose to describe Meghan as a private, intimate girl wasn't just a revelation about her. It was a confession about what he had seen, allowed, and stayed silent about for far too long. But what pushed him to finally cross that line? That answer changes everything. So why speak now? That's the question hanging over everything. Because people don't break years of silence unless something inside them finally snaps. According to those close to the situation, Markus didn't wake up one day looking for attention. He didn't suddenly want relevance. In fact, the timing of his words is what unsettled so many people, because nothing about it was convenient. By the time Markus allegedly described Meghan as a private, intimate girl, the public narrative around her was already locked in. Supporters had chosen sides. Critics had drawn conclusions. Books had been written. Documentaries released. Interviews dissected frame by frame. There was no obvious benefit for him in speaking at all, which raises the most uncomfortable possibility of all. What if he wasn't speaking to change the public's mind about Meghan? What if he was speaking to finally make peace with himself? Think about it. Living inside someone else's carefully controlled world for years doesn't leave you untouched. You start adjusting your own behavior. You watch your words. You learn what topics disappear people. You sense which truths are welcomed and which ones quietly end relationships. Over time, silence stops feeling passive. It starts feeling heavy. Markus, according to those familiar with his thinking, reached a point where staying quiet felt like lying. Not to the public, but to himself. Because once you see how intimacy is used, once you recognize the patterns, you can't unsee them. And pretending otherwise becomes its own kind of betrayal. Here's the part that brings the story full circle. When Markus described Meghan the way he did, he wasn't tearing her down. He wasn't attacking her. He wasn't even contradicting her public statements outright. He was doing something far more destabilizing. He was reframing her. Suddenly, the contradictions made sense. The sudden breaks. The emotional distance masked as vulnerability. The way people seemed close to her one moment and erased the next. The calm during chaos. The composure while others unraveled. The opening question returns now, heavier than before. What if the person who knew Meghan best was the one who stayed quiet the longest? And what if that silence wasn't proof of innocence, but proof of proximity? This doesn't offer a clean ending. There's no villain speech, no dramatic confession, just an unsettling realization that power doesn't always look the way we expect it to. Sometimes it looks like restraint, like control, like deciding who gets access and who never quite does. So here's the real takeaway. When someone is described as private and intimate, that doesn't automatically mean gentle or vulnerable. Sometimes it means guarded, strategic, and deeply aware of the influence they hold over others' emotions. And Markus? He may never say everything he knows. He may never fully step into the spotlight. But the fact that he spoke at all suggests something shifted behind the scenes. Something cracked. And if this is what he was willing to say out loud, you have to ask yourself one final question. What is he still choosing not to say?